left analysis of nonviolence in her rereading of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X's legacies and their evolution, trying to present a more balanced legacy, but also her reading of Mahatma Gandhi and his followers and his impact, of course, on Martin Luther King Jr., such that part of what she presents as a radical transformation for our time is a transformation that is mediated by nothing less than love. And instead of being an idealist position that is considered as something feminized and not serious, she argues in this last book that, in fact, love is part of, what unites us in an interdependence politics. So, without, taking more time from the speakers we've come to see, I want to thank you again and welcome Grace Lee Boggs and Angela Davis.
I'll speak first. What's the format? First? Should I go first? Okay. I'm sorry. Right. Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Okay, so the format of what we're going to do right now, we are running a little bit behind time, is we're going to begin with some remarks by Professor Angela Davis first, maybe 10 or 15 minutes if that seems good, and then followed by some remarks by Grace Lee Boggs, and then afterwards a Q&A.
Okay. First of all, it's really good to see you, Grace. It's an unimaginable honor for me to share the stage with you this afternoon. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the indigenous people who are the original inhabitants of the land on which we meet this afternoon. And let us never forget that our presence here is very much related to the genocidal violence inflicted on this area's native people. And if we believe in justice, we must stand for justice for native people in the 21st century. Now, I have to say that I received incorrect information. I was told that we would each speak about a half an hour and then engage in conversation. So I'm going to have to cut my remarks. But I also want to thank Scott Khurshigi, who, as you know, collaborated with Grace Lee Boggs on her last book. And he is the one whom I met at an American Studies conference somewhere and suggested that we engage in conversation. And I said it would be the absolute greatest honor in my political life to have the opportunity to engage in public conversation with Grace Lee Boggs. I'm also really happy that this is a part of the Empowering Women of Color conference. I spoke last year, I spoke in 1995, in 1992, and also in 1985. And we are speaking this afternoon about revolution. And I want to first say that I came to revolutionary struggle through the Black freedom movement. And I say this in vast appreciation of the contributions that Grace Lee Boggs and her late husband, James Boggs, made to what we now call the Black radical tradition. I was very fortunate to grow up in a family of activists. My mother was active in a whole number of struggles in the Southern Negro Youth Congress, and the campaign to prevent the Scottsboro Nine from being executed. But I must say that when I became involved in organizations like the Black Panther Party, both my mother and father were quite upset, especially because they perceived figures like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, H. Rap Brown, with whom I was associated, as inappropriate revolutionaries, I suppose. And I say this because I want to make the point that radical and revolutionary movements always have to be spearheaded by young people. And by those who are not afraid to identify with the boldness and imaginativeness and the courage of young people. And I really agree with the point that, that Grace always makes, that we have to move beyond the stage of merely protesting the oppressions in this world, and we have to begin to creatively imagine a new world. What would a fundamentally transformed society look like? Not only what would it look like, what would it feel like? What would it feel like? I mentioned the Black radical tradition as an important moment in the trajectory, in my own trajectory towards revolutionary struggle. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that this tradition was not simply forged by people of African descent, but by people of many racial, ethnic, national backgrounds, and especially by women of color. And of course, we know that Grace Lee Boggs has played an absolutely formative role in the forging of what we call the Black radical tradition. And because we are here in Berkeley, in the Bay Area, I want to also mention Elizabeth Betita Martinez. And I want to mention Yuri Kochiyama. Yuri Kochiyama. Now, we're talking about revolution this afternoon. And I suppose the major point that I would like to offer you is that revolutionary approaches require us to open up and make our ideas and our movements broader and more capacious, so that what is revolutionary is not narrow and exclusive, but rather broad and inclusive. And the linkages and connections that we must make if we are attempting to move toward revolutionary struggle are of the sort evoked by women of color feminism. We all know the term intersectionality now. And I think that that radical women of color feminists, especially those whose feminism is inflected with Marxism, have produced some of the most important revolutionary ideas and strategies. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about the Black radical tradition and the fact that it is recognized all over the world. And there are perhaps two struggles that have this kind of international stature, and that is the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the Black freedom movement in this country. And I mention them not because they are the most important struggles, but simply because people are aware of them. There's probably no one on the planet who has not heard the name of Nelson Mandela. And probably very few people on the planet who don't recognize the name of Martin Luther King. I'm mentioning this because, first of all, we here in the US, although the Black radical tradition was forged in the Americas, we can't really claim that tradition. It belongs to everyone. And I want to mention very specifically the Palestinian people, because, as we know, I hope we know, last November, young Palestinians associated with the BDS movement, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, decided to desegregate public transportation in the occupied territories. They were inspired by the freedom riders of the 1960s, of 1960. And as a matter of fact, boarded buses that were meant for the exclusive use of Jewish settlers within the occupied territory of Palestine, and they were arrested. And then others challenged the roadways, because there are highways that are also segregated, that are only meant for, is that 10 more seconds? Okay, I saw 10 go up. I said, oh my God, do I have 10 more seconds? Now, let me, I'm going to try to speed this up. Oh. And so the point that I'm making is that the Black struggle for freedom here in the Americas has had profound implications for people in other nations, for other people of color, for people struggling for a freedom everywhere, for members of LGBT communities, for women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, for working class people, for people with physical and mental disabilities. And we can also think about the implications of that struggle for our current efforts to save the environment, as Grace Lee Boggs has been doing for some time now. And to save the environment not only for the generations of human beings that will hopefully follow us, but also for generations of non-human beings. And I also want to evoke food politics. Why does the food we eat poison us instead of nurturing our bodies and our minds? How many people have diabetes or heart disease as a direct result of consuming industrially produced food that is designed to generate profit more than it is designed to nourish our bodies, our minds, and our souls? In November of last year, I had the opportunity to participate in several of the major Occupy mobilizations here in Oakland, as a matter of fact. And it was really, how many of you were there? All right. The general strike, right? And I think that when we experience such moments, we have to preserve them for the revolutionary promise that they offer. You know, obviously, revolution is not going to happen in a single day or a single year, but there are moments that inspire us. And I can remember on that day looking around at the people at that gathering, the march. It was multi-racial, it was multi-ethnic, it was multi-gender, it was multi-generational. And there was something very palpable about the community of resistance that we were forging. And what has been most important, it seems to me, about the upsurge in activism over the last period, including in Wisconsin, and let us not forget the workers' struggle in Wisconsin, and in Cairo, and in New York. And what is most important, I think, is that perhaps for the first time since the 1930s, which we saw depicted in the wonderful film about Grace Lee Boggs that we saw, perhaps for the very first time since the 1930s, we can speak openly and publicly about the perils of capitalism. And so what Grace Lee Boggs calls the New American Revolution, and you should really read the book, that revolution will have to be a feminist revolution, a feminist of color revolution, against capitalism, against racism, against heteropatriarchy. And it will have to be a revolution that emphasizes education and health and an end to the prison industrial complex. And let me conclude by saying that if we pose revolutionary demands for justice, our demands for justice will lead us to demands for prison abolition. And our demands for prison abolition will lead to demands for free, quality education. And our demands for free, quality education will lead to demands for free, quality health care and housing and an end to racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia. And all of this requires us to think very seriously about the role that capitalism plays in all of this. And so as I conclude, I want to pay tribute to the great Black feminist revolutionary poet June Jordan, who spent the last years of her life teaching students on this campus how to produce poetry for the people. She was a great revolutionary poet, and she was the one who wrote the words, "We are the ones we have been waiting for." Thank you.
Thank you, Elsa. Can you hear me? Yes. How are we doing? at this. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Empowering Women of Color Planning Committee, for organizing this event. It's a fantastic time to be meeting and to be talking about revolution. And, you know, to come and listen to two women who are both philosophers and activists, that's a great privilege too. I'm a very old woman. I was born in 1915 in what is later known as the First World War, 2 years before the Russian Revolution. And because I was born to Chinese immigrant parents, and because I was born female, I learned very quickly that the world needed changing. But what I also learned as I grew older was that how we change the world and how we think about changing the world has to change. When I was in college and shortly thereafter, most people looked to the Russian Revolution as the model of revolution. But that was beginning to change. And in the 30s, the Italian Marxist Gramsci began to talk about revolution not as an assault on state power and not as a war of movement, but as a war of position, where that was much more horizontal than vertical, where we transform ourselves and our institutions and challenge the cultural hegemony of the ruling class. And that began to change concepts of revolution and how we internalize that enormous and important change and recognize that that is what is now on the clock of the world, I think is what we have to talk about today. In the 1950s, Einstein said, "The splitting of the atom has changed everything but the human mind, and thus we drift toward catastrophe." And he also said that imagination is more important than education. In other words, the time has come for us to reimagine everything. We have to reimagine work and go away from labor. We have to reimagine revolution and get beyond protest. We have to reimagine revolution and think not only about the change in our institutions, but the changes we have to make in ourselves. We are at the stage where the people in charge of the government and of industry are running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And it's up to us to reimagine the alternative and not just to protest against them and expect them to do better. We are at the point of a cultural revolution in ourselves and in our institutions that is as far-reaching as a transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture 11,000 years ago, and from agriculture to industry a few hundred years ago. How do we reimagine education? How do we reimagine community? How do we reimagine family? How do we reimagine sexual identity? How do we reimagine everything in the light of a change that's so far-reaching and that it's our responsibility to make? We can't expect them to make it. we have to do the reimagining ourselves. We have to think beyond categories. We have to reimagine. And how do we do that? We do that, I have found, by combining activism with philosophy. And that's why it's so important that Angela and I are here on this platform, that we are both philosophic activists. We're both activist philosophers. We can't think anymore that all we have to do is to act. We have to do a lot of thinking. We have to do a lot of imagination. We have to do what I call visionary organizing. We have to see every crisis as both a danger and an opportunity. It's a danger because it does so much damage to our lives, to our institutions, to all that we have expected. But it's also an opportunity for us to become creative, for us to become the new kind of people that are needed at such a huge period of transition. And that's why it's so wonderful that we're here today. That we dare to talk about revolution in such fundamental terms. I came to Detroit nearly 60 years ago, and since that time I've lived in the same house most of the time. When I came to Detroit, there were 2 million people there. The Chrysler plant where my husband worked, 10 minutes. Okay, the Chrysler plant where my husband worked employed 17,000 workers. Within another year, I mean, outside my house, if you threw a stone up in the air, you'd hit a Chrysler worker on the way down. Within the next year, the 17,000 workers at the Chrysler plant had dwindled to 2,000. And within a very short time, automation, high-tech, was eliminating the jobs that had made Detroit the arsenal of democracy during World War II. How do we grapple with a change as remarkable as that? How do we take advantage of high-tech to create a new mode of production? How do we use it to make ourselves more self-reliant and more productive? I mean, we have to reimagine work. We can't talk about jobs anymore. We can't beg for jobs or hope for jobs. And we have to recognize that jobs during the industrial period were actually a way of fragmentation of our humanity. And that we began to depend on higher wages and consumer goods to compensate for our dehumanization. We have to create forms of work that create community, that involve and expand our humanity. I mean, that's where we are. And that's how we have to talk about revolution these days. And that's how each of us has begun to think. We have to get rid of the old ideas of leadership and followership and begin to think or use our imaginations to create the new. We have been very lucky in Detroit that out of the devastation of deindustrialization, we have recognized the need to create a post-modern, a post-industrial society. We are doing that. And I urge you to come to Detroit this July and get an idea of, to share the experience of the American Revolution that we're making and to begin to do your own visionary organizing back in your own community. We have the opportunity, we have the challenge at this period on the clock of the world to create a new humanity, to create a new society, to create a whole new paradigm of education. We have to think of education and the young people not as a problem, but as the solution. We have to enlist them in the solution of the problems of our community. That's a whole new way of reimagining youth. and the relationship between generations. And that's an enormous challenge. That's an enormous task, and it's up to you to do it. I'm very old. I'm very hard of hearing. I'm very shaky on my feet. Thank goodness Charlotte is here, captioning everything that's being said so that I can read it. Because my eyesight is better than my hearing. And so, anyway, that's all I gotta say. Okay, where do we go from here?
So now, conversation between the two of you, please.
Oh, we get to talk to each other. And you get to eavesdrop. I was really, may I ask the first question?
Go ahead, please.
Okay. I was totally impressed by your notion of transforming the very nature of work. Because of course we find ourselves in a period with rising unemployment, and the tendency is simply to demand more jobs. Also education, the tendency is to demand greater access to education, but we don't necessarily ask ourselves what needs to be transformed about education and what needs to be transformed in the way we conceive of work. You know, I was always really impressed by Marx's notion that through our labor we externalize our own creative impulses, and that actually work should be fulfilling. Workers should possibly be able to have the same relationship to that which they produce as artists have to their art. And because you brought up the issue of technological innovation and automation and so forth, it occurred to me that we really need to talk about a shorter work day. I mean, if it seems to me that by now, given all of the struggles for shorter work days that have been going on for decades and decades, and somehow or another we got stuck with the 8-hour day, I don't understand why we didn't go to 6 hours. And from there, why we didn't go to 4 hours. By now, the workday really should be 4 hours, so that even if the work isn't as fulfilling as we would like it to be, we would have the rest of our time to engage in more fulfilling and more creative activities.
It seems to me that we need to talk not only about the hours of work, but about the difference between the way women look at work and the way you have a job. You have jobs that demean you, that dehumanize you, that fragment you, that make you appendage to a machine, and you make up for it by demanding higher wages or shorter hours. What we need is the kind of work that women do, not counting the hours because they care. And that's a real transformation from a patriarchal concept of work to a matriarchal concept of work. And that's where we are. I mean, we are so deeply fundamental in terms of our human identity at this moment. And until we've approached this moment with that challenge in mind, we're going to get lost.
You know, it reminds me, I was in Colombia about a year ago, and I had the opportunity to visit a community in La Toma, which is outside of Cali, a group of, a large community of African-descended people who live at the top of this mountain, and the Colombian government was trying to evict them from their land. Almost everybody there was a miner, gold miner, because as a matter of fact, their history had been of being brought from Africa as slaves to do gold mining. And I was so impressed by the relationship they had to their work. They engaged in the kind of gold mining that did not affect the landscape. You could hardly tell that gold mining was being done. And women were miners, and children were miners. And the women we spoke to said that they felt like they had been miners ever since they were in their mother's wombs. And they loved the work of mining for gold. And it struck me because I don't think I had ever heard anyone talk about that kind of relationship to work unless the person was an artist. And in the process of doing this gold mining, as I said before, they did not disturb that landscape at all. The entrance to the mine was about half the height of a human being, so you could not even tell that the area was being mined.
Well, I think that's a wonderful example of the paradigm shifts that we need to make. If we can think of the work as the work that the artist does, in the love for the material, in the vision that he or she has, instead of thinking of it as a way that we have colonized the materials, that we have colonized people, that we have colonized the earth. I mean, the abuse that we have done, not only to each other, not only to people of color, but to the earth and to ourselves, to our own humanity, has been horrendous. And to recognize how horrendous it has been, and therefore the need to create an alternative that is more human, is the kind of revolution we have to make. And with all the good that the Occupy Wall Street movement has done, I don't find that their language, their ideas are profound enough. They are against the corporations, rightly. They are against the greed and the avarice that corrupts our society. But the need to imagine an alternative in philosophical and human terms, the need to grow our souls, and to say that proudly and unashamedly, to talk about the kind of tremendous human transformation we have to make. We must be courageous enough to think that way, and to talk that way, and to relate that way.
I mean, I do think the Occupy phenomenon is important, but it isn't a solution. It's an opening. It's a beginning.
How do we take advantage of the opening?
Exactly. That's the question. How do we take advantage of the opening? You know, one of the things that I heard some people saying, there are just a lot of homeless people around the encampments. But why wouldn't there be homeless people around the encampments? I mean, one of the things I thought was really important about that period, when there were encampments in 900 cities around the world, was that people who were relatively affluent had to learn how to cohabit the same space with homeless people, and to begin to work through strategies of being together. And I think that was a promise. That was a moment of promise. I don't know, maybe I'm the inveterate optimist.
No, I think you're right. And I think when we stopped just marching and began to stay in one place and face the issues that were challenging, like the homeless, that we could move. Our imaginations of a new way of creating a harmonious society were challenged. And that's where we are. It's a wonderful, wonderful time to be alive.
I totally agree with you. Those of us who've been around for a little while, and I am often referred to as an elder, and I'm not sure exactly what that means,
I know
but it's
what it
okay.
means. It means being hard of hearing.
But I also think it means that you have to, that you are expected to have the kind of wisdom that you've imparted today, and you are expected to perhaps, I don't know, sometimes I feel as if those of us who are older are expected to be the people who young people want to be approved by. There's and I think that can sometimes be problematic.
Well, I had 6 young people come to do an interview with me this morning. And I'm really very happy about this moment, because the human race has evolved because we have not had the segregation of the race, of the generations. But in the last period, that's what we have suffered. And I think the segregation of the generations is more, maybe I shouldn't use a make comparison, but is extraordinarily destructive. And the young people really want to bridge that gap. That's what I find is happening. And that's why I'm still here. And Angela, you've got to be here too. How many old people are in this room? Raise your hand. How do we reintegrate the set generations? Let's begin tomorrow to do those things, those very human things. Begin creating those relationships, those human relationships that we need to evolve, to continue evolving. Let's see that as our work. I mean, Martin Luther King said that we must rapidly make the transition from a thing-oriented to a person-oriented society. Let's take that as our challenge. How do we do that? How do we take responsibility for all our security? How do we restore the neighbor to the hood? How do we take responsibility for growing our own food instead of depending on these huge corporations which use all this gas and produce global warming and also give us polluted, contaminated food with additives? I mean, these are very human questions. And the revolution has to be around questions like that and not just questions of how do I get more money.
Yeah, I am really interested in the work that you're doing around food, because I think that that is one of the next major arenas of struggle. And I am sometimes really disappointed that, that many of us can assume that we are these radical activists, but we don't know how to reflect on the food that we put in our own bodies. We don't realize the extent to which we are implicated in the whole process of capitalism by participating uncritically in the food politics offered us by the great corporations. And you know, I usually don't mention that I'm vegan, but that has evolved, I think, and I think it's the right moment to talk about it, because it is, I think, a part of a revolutionary perspective. How can we not only discover more compassionate relations with human beings, but how can we develop compassionate relations with the other creatures with whom we share this planet? And that would mean challenging the whole capitalist industrial form of food production. It would mean being aware, driving up the interstates and driving down 5 and you know, down to LA, seeing all of the cows on all of the ranches there. You know, most people don't think about the fact that they're eating animals. When they, you know, eat a steak or eat a chicken, most people don't think about the horrendous suffering that those animals must endure simply in order to become food products to be consumed by human beings. And I think that the lack of critical engagement with the food that we eat demonstrates the extent to which the commodity form has become the primary way in which we perceive the world. We don't go further than what Marx called the exchange value of the actual object. We don't think about the relations that that object embodies and that were important to the production of that object. Whether it's our food or our clothes or our iPads or all of the materials we use to acquire an education at an institution like this. And so I think that would really be revolutionary, to develop a kind of a repertoire, a habit of imagining the relations, the human relations and the non-human relations behind all of the objects that constitute our environment.
Did you want to say that we entered a new period? Oh, you do.
So I've been asked, because we had so many people coming in and it took us a while to sit down, and out of consideration for Grace Lee Boggs' health, that maybe what we could do now is have a couple of questions that I could pose to both Angela and Grace and have them both address them for us. And it looks like we won't have time for the Q&A, since we've been trying to stay within the 6 o'clock, the 2-hour range, out of consideration for our guests. So one of the questions I would like to ask both of you is if you could tell us, really following the conversation that you have been having, if you could speak to us more about this concept that Grace talks about, growing our souls in community by building community. What do you mean by that? Growing our souls in community by building community. How can we understand that?
Well, I hope, I first used the concept of growing our souls about 10 years ago in a speech. And radicals don't usually talk about souls, but I think we have to be courageous enough about talking about what I mean by soul is the capacity to create the world anew, which each of us has. And how do we talk about that with one another? How do we, because it's important to talk. It's not only important to act, but when you talk, you begin to create new ideas, you create new language. And we have all been damaged by the system. It's not only the capitalists who are the scoundrels, who are the villains. We are all part of it. And we all have to change what we say, what we do, what we think, what we imagine.
Thank you. Angela, would you also address, what kind of resonances that has for you, thinking about, soul and growing that in community?
Well, I can say very briefly that in this era of neoliberalism, we have all learned how to imagine ourselves primarily as individuals. It is as if we have forgotten that we are always members of communities. And I'm totally seduced by your notion of growing the soul and growing a soul that experiences itself in the context of communities and collectivities. There is the tendency to think of ourselves as isolated individuals, and of course, this is what what the capitalists have achieved, and capitalism is grounded in that notion that the individual, the possessive individual, is the primary unit of society. And if we are to move toward revolutionary approaches, we have to relearn, and I say relearn because I think that that somewhere deep inside we all should recognize that we are connected to each other and to every single being on this planet. So thank you so much for that wonderful notion of growing our souls in community.
I also want to take advantage of having these two amazing intellects on stage with us to help us think about nonviolence today, because historically in the left, it has been a really difficult thing to try to think about. How do we produce change through nonviolence? And are we talking about nonviolence on the individual personal level as well as the social? What is the relationship that both of you see between practices and politics of nonviolence on the personal level and as well as in all the various communal levels?
Well, I think that this relates to what we're talking about growing our souls. I was not a supporter of Martin Luther King during the early period because I was more in Detroit talking about Black Power and Malcolm. But when violence began to break out among us, I think we had to begin rethinking. Why is nonviolence such an important, not just a tactic, not just a strategy, but an important philosophy? Because it respects the capacity of human beings to grow. It gives them the opportunity to grow their souls, and we owe that to each other. And I used to think of it in very purely political, narrow, superficial terms. But, you know, you grow older, you grow wiser.
Great, thank you. Angela, would you also share your thoughts on this with us?
Okay, that's a very complicated question for me. Because when we raise the question of nonviolence, I think that in the very first place, we have to acknowledge that the purveyors of the vast majority of violence in the world are the nation states with the vast militaries, the U.S. government, for example, Israel, for example. And so yes, we need nonviolence, but I would say let's start by abolishing the military and disarming the police. Because it seems to me that so much of the violence that we inflict on each other is linked in some way or another to that institutional violence. And this is one of the wonderful insights of what has often been called women of color feminism, that private violence or intimate violence or privatized violence is very much connected to institutionalized violence. Violence in the streets is connected to violence in the suites. Violence that happens in terms of sexual violence is linked to the fact that violent strategies are embraced by the corporations, by governments. So I think a truly revolutionary strategy would allow us to imagine ways of abolishing violence in all of its manifestations.
All of you who are clapping, I suggest you do some more thinking. You know, it's a philosophic question. It's not just a tactical question. A philosophical, when I was a junior in college, a sophomore in college actually, I decided to drop all my courses and take philosophy. If you had asked me what philosophy was all about, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. I was only in my late teens. But as I've grown older, I realized that philosophy has to do with how we value ourselves as human beings and how we look at ourselves and how we relate to reality. And that it's something that requires a lot of courage, because everybody else wants to act. And they think that they quote, philosophers only contemplate reality, the thing is to change it. But I think that's a false counterposition. And if we think about it a great deal more and talk about it a great deal more, we will learn that out of our respect for ourselves and our respect for each other, nonviolence is something we have to embrace. And it'll take me a long time to learn that.
Okay. I want to actually ask Grace and Angela, if they will just say one more thing to us, because I think that also, like as a guide for all of us right now, we've been trying to rethink how do we work together in community, and the importance of grassroots work. I think sometimes we ask ourselves, are we doing enough? Is this group too small? And so I would just, if you would, I'd just like to ask you for a few words about that, your thoughts about the grassroots community work and its impact on the larger kinds of social justice issues to which we're committed.
Well, I'd like to say something about the crisis that we faced in Detroit in the 1980s. In the wake of the rebellions, a lot of violence had broken out in the city. Out of many of the veterans who were coming back from the Vietnam War, we were developing a crack society, a lot of crack, a lot of violence against one another. And the question, what Coleman Young, who was the first black mayor of Detroit, proposed was that we should create a casino industry to create jobs, because he said the lack of jobs was responsible for the violence. And we said no. The alternative was to involve the young people in the rebuilding, the redefining, and the re-inspiriting of the city from the ground up. And we created this program called Detroit Summer. And Shay Howell was the coordinator of the first Detroit Summer for the years thereafter. I think that is a visionary organizing. How do we rebuild? How do we redefine? How do we re-spirit our communities and one another? That's our challenge. And we can't say and expect Obama or Mitt Romney, whatever, to abolish the war in Afghanistan. I mean, they have put us in those wars. They have created the crisis. They are not going to solve it. We're the ones who have to solve it by creating another kind of society and take advantage of their helplessness and their powerlessness to do it.
Thank you, Grace.
Okay. I'm going to say something that may be a bit controversial, since we're talking about revolution. I'm remembering when Obama was elected, a little over 3 years ago, and that was a moment that was so incredible. For a few days, the whole world was transformed. Do you remember? And, I keep telling myself, I have to remember what it felt like to walk down the streets of Oakland and people that you did not know would come up and hug you. And people were singing in the streets and dancing in the streets. Of course, we've forgotten that. And an enormous amount of grassroots organizing enable that victory. That was a victory not of an individual, but that was a victory of people all over this country who refused to believe that it was impossible to elect a black person who identified with the black radical tradition. Now, everybody said it was not possible. The vast majority of black people did not support Obama initially. They supported Hillary because Obama was unelectable. The problem was, I think we all assumed that that's all we had to do, was elect him and then go back to doing what we were doing before. And the reason I said I'm going to say something controversial is because I think that despite all of the disappointments, and we could go on and on and on about what Obama has not done, and about Afghanistan, and about Guantanamo, and about health care, and all of that. About immigrant rights. I mean, not even the DREAM Act, which was this really puny bill that would have been just a minor baby step in the direction of immigrant rights, the rights of undocumented immigrants. But anyway, what I'm going to say is that I think we need to figure out how to prevent somebody like Mitt Romney from being elected. And let me just say one more thing. One more thing. And I think that this time around, we have to engage in that campaign with our eyes open. And I say this as someone who never voted for for a candidate representing one of the major parties until I voted for Obama. That was the very first time I hadn't voted for, communist or peace and freedom or green or whatever. And I think this time around, we have to recognize that we're not campaigning for an individual. We're campaigning for ourselves. Because, as June Jordan said, we are the ones we have been waiting for, and we can't go home after election night. We can't assume that all is well.
Let's talk about that.
See, I told you it was going to be controversial.
The civil rights struggle was a tremendous victory to be celebrated. But it created new contradictions. It created a black middle class. It created black legislators. It created black presidents.
One black president thus far.
So how do we understand that every victory creates new and more challenging contradictions? How do we prepare for that? How do we always think dialectically and recognize that one divides into two? Otherwise, we get stuck. And that's why philosophy is so important. To think dialectically and not biologically. Because the danger in our society is to think biologically.
I totally agree with you on that. And we have to, and one of the things that, we're starting a whole new conversation, and there's a big sign that says finish with an exclamation point there. But may I just say one last thing? Because we haven't had the opportunity to speak very much this evening on issues of gender and sexuality. And the point that you make about not thinking biologically is so important. We're just now beginning to realize how how binary thinking around gender has completely allowed us to internalize the state. And since you spoke early so eloquently about the need to transform ourselves, how can we detect the extent to which the state is present in our heads, in our emotions? How are our emotions structured by that kind of binary biological thinking that you were talking about. And so I just want to say that we need to think really deeply about issues of gender and multiple notions of gender. And what I find so exciting about being involved in revolutionary struggle is precisely what you pointed out, Grace, that each time we win a victory, we have simply created a terrain for the recognition of a whole new set of issues. And so we can't even imagine where you will be 50 years from now. We can't imagine how you will think about issues of gender or race or sexuality. And I think that possibility of infinite transformation is precisely what Hegel was talking about when he said that history is progress in the consciousness of freedom.
I'd like to encourage folks not only to think dialectically and philosophically, but also to think more about our brains, about neuroscience, and about the capacity we have to think anew, but how we can only do that if we understand that there's a tendency in the structure of our brains to get fixed into old categories, to get locked into old concepts. And that's why our philosophy is really important. So I hope that everyone will emerge from this conversation thinking dialectically, thinking philosophically, thinking about growing our souls.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Angela, for a life of leadership, of courage, of inspiration. You've helped all of us grow our souls. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I also just want to say that Grace has graciously offered to stay a little bit after to sign books with the Boggs Center table in the back. Thank you. And this is the kickoff to the Empowering Women of Color Conference, which is tomorrow. So please come.